Welcome to StrangersX. I'm your host, Zainab Tangachira, and we're recording this in the wake of the India AI Impact Summit, a moment that felt like a seismic shift for the global south. For the first time, a conversation or the conversation moved past just AI safety and toward AI impact, positioning both India and the global south as the third way or alternative to the US and Chinese digital stacks. But for African nations, the question remains, is this third way a genuine path to sovereignty, or just a new theater for the same old geopolitical hedging? Joining me today to navigate these waters is Jane Munga, fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Jane, your work has been a lighthouse in showing us that DPI isn't just about the technology, it's about the governance and institutions we build around it. Jane, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here and always good to see you, Zainab.
Likewise. Definitely trying my best not to fan out, but yeah, I'm really glad that you accepted the invite. So thank you. Starting out with India, that was the most recent big thing that happened in the space. The New Delhi summit pitched a third way for the global south to avoid picking sides between the US and China. In your view, is this a real pathway for African digital self-determination, or are we just seeing a more crowded field of geopolitical competition?
Thank you, Zainab. And again, let me just say how it's such a pleasure to be speaking to you and just to talk candidly about some of the things that are beginning to shape the world and the views, like you say, now a third way. Before I go directly to the question, also, it's good to highlight that the India AI Impact Summit was such a key moment, and it was a key event, especially for the Global South. It was the first time that the AI Action Summit or the summit was in the Global South. And for those of us who are in there, it was also a moment of reckoning that the style and the scope of the summit has changed. This was a summit that was truly democratized in how it brought the conversations and the numbers. Coming from Paris and coming and going to New Delhi, it was clear that India made a specific push to have as many people come to the conference, bring as many conversations to the meeting to ensure that those of the Global South were equally and adequately represented within this conversation. So the conversation of the third way is then born out of this atmosphere that there was a reckoning that there is already what we call the global majority. And they too have a space in the AI space, in the DPI space. And it is possible for countries to thrive in this space in their own, contextualized with their own application, contextualized with their own policies, and contextualized with how they want this to shape. What we began to see, even in our research, and as we walked into the AI summit, we had published a paper about practical pathways for AI and DPI for the global south and how the countries in the global south can partner around this. So there's a reckoning that right now there are ways of how what we'd call a third way, or a way that works for the global south of the countries that are in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, that have primarily not been the forefront of these conversations, but are also actively engaged. And when we look at how they're actively engaged, for them, it's about how these technologies can be a part of digital transformation, how this part, how technologies, not just AI, even like DPI, we saw that came out of India, how it becomes a tool to serve the people through its foundations, through its rails, through its infrastructure, and through its systems. So this third way, for me, I see it as a way of countries first understanding that, yes, we need alternatives that work for us. And that are designed by the citizens of these countries. So first, it's a reckoning that what is being shaped by the North, and not to say first, let me be very careful and put this caveat, not to say that it's all bad. It's not
Yes,
all bad, but there are some nuances that we have to be when technology is shaping, either it's in the infrastructure itself or who controls the infrastructure
absolutely.
or how that infrastructure is being used, is what countries are beginning to understand that also shapes the outcome. So how do we better shape this outcome? By being also on the driver's seat, or at least building upon that which is there. Because I think this is the key thing that the third way is trying to establish, is that now we need technology that speaks for us, talks for us, and also solves our the issues that are common in the global south.
hmm I think you
Mm.
really grounded that really well by pointing out to the emphasis by India around that we need to focus more on democratization, right? And we cannot speak about democracy without speaking about access, improving access. And so even when we speak about AI for good, India spoke about was the language was more about AI for all, right? Impact for all.
Yeah.
And I know you just looking at your work is that what your work has emphasized in recent times is that a decisive factor in this conversation is that it's no longer important or just important to only focus on the technical capability, but rather that it's important to start thinking about governance as an infrastructure, and that's the point you made right at the end there. So, drawing on the outcomes of from
Mhm.
India, and also the argument as well that you recently made that as AI moves from screens to the physical economy, in the sense of where we usually used to just speak about managing our grids, agriculture, and ports, right? Governance itself becomes the new infrastructure. So post New Delhi, when we see these massive or have seen these massive investment pledges in physical the physical layer or the physical infrastructure in the form of AI and data centers, are African countries, in your opinion, prepared for the reality that a failure in AI governance is no longer just a digital glitch or weakness, but rather a systemic physical risk? And how do you move from this aspirational summit declarations, which is the bane of our existence as practitioners in the global south, especially to the frontline governance you've been advocating for quite a while?
Um, this question is, I think, is extremely critical, and of course, and it's one that when you've captured it, I just think that it's one that is already has been on the front lines of many policymakers, especially those in the global south. For our work at Carnegie, at the Africa program, we focus, since I'm in the Africa program, we have our direct focus is what's shaping the continent. And in the last 1 year, we have spent considerable time trying to answer a variant of that question, is just first understanding how AI policymakers and decision makers are shaping the AI governance space. One of the things that has become extremely critical and begins to understand that you really have to be in a position of defining the kind of infrastructure that you have is the understanding, the awareness that the digital infrastructure is what will shape the outcomes,
Mhm,
and so even more the governance around it. African countries understand they may not have all the infrastructure around it. So they do need a plan on how to adequately or build their capabilities
mhm,
for the kind of digital infrastructure they need. So we've seen countries becoming more and more in the front lines of developing their AI strategies and policies. And why I think this is the beginning point and a critical point is because once you have a plan, then you can start executing it.
mhm,
Digital infrastructure and AI infrastructure will continue to evolve, will continue to grow. It's a technology that continues to shape the times we are in. And that means that if African stakeholders and countries want to shape how they benefit from this, they need to devise their own plan. And
mhm,
this has been seen in strategies and policies.
mhm,
So we've seen about 20 or so. We've been tracking this. And what is critical in looking at these documents is what they're saying. First, as I had mentioned earlier, they are all looking at how do we use AI for digital transformation.
mhm,
For them, that's their primary driver for this. But the second thing is the realization that they may not have all the capabilities to do that. They
mhm,
don't have the infrastructure around this.
mhm,
So they put an emphasis on understanding the kind of digital infrastructure that is needed for that. Is it compute? Is it connectivity? This is a big issue for African countries. We're still talking about 37. The ITU says there's about 36% of Africans who are using the internet.
mhm.
AI is digital, so at the end of the day, you want people to be connected to the internet or have
Yes.
access to devices. The second thing is skills. If someone is connected but you don't know what to do when you're
Mhm,
there, is becomes another issue. Third is applications. What kind of applications are being designed? And applications that serve Africans. So
Yes.
a lot of the policymakers have identified 4 areas. They've identified the area of climate, public governance or public sector delivery, education, and health as
Mm-hmm.
the key areas that they want to focus on this. So then this becomes the package and the lens as to which that we look now at digital infrastructure. Can it build these applications for us? Is it infrastructure that is affordable also? And then it comes to who can we get it from? And one thing also, it's also become evidently clear by practice
Mm-hmm.
is amidst the geopolitical tensions between the US, between China, and how that is shaping this space. For African countries, they continue to partner with both sides. Traditionally, if you look at most African countries, they've had very strong partnerships with
Mm-hmm.
China that has helped them build what I would call the digital rails. When you look at the telecom towers, when you look at the fiber optic that is mostly running across the continent, there's a lot of huge and immense Chinese technology that is powering this. But other partners are also beginning to come into the space. The US, even coming out of the India AI Summit, has continued to be a champion of its technology,
Mm-hmm.
what it's able to offer. It has the AI stack, and it's positioning itself as the supreme contender within this space. It has the superior technology, and it wants to surface this to African countries. So now this becomes that point of that lever point of how do countries start maneuvering around these geopolitics, yet discharging their own agendas of how do they ensure that they have the critical infrastructure that they need without dependencies, because
Mm-hmm.
this we have also to remember some of the historical issues
Yes.
that we're already beginning to see in the continent and that are there in the continent.
Mm-hmm.
We should not be building more air infrastructure that is dependent
Yes.
on one particular country or one particular technology that is locked in, vendor lock-in, or you don't even have agency around it. And I
Mm-hmm.
think this is now where policymakers have to become extremely cautious and
Innovative.
how they design these plans.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and innovative. I think that's critical. That yes, we understand that you need these partnerships, but at the end of the day, do these partnerships work for you?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have agency around them? Are you able to control the data that is flowing in it and the applications? So the economic gains that are coming out of this structure, how do you benefit from them? And how do you ensure that they're also building your ecosystem so you're able to build your own talent and to grow out of this? So these are some of the nuances now that we see. Yes, there are these international conversations, there is international geopolitics that are driving this space, but even for African countries, the tensions and the realities that are there continue to drive how policymakers should and are beginning to actively position for this. We saw a lot of partnerships between South-South countries beginning to emanate. India in itself is becoming such a strong contender
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to DPI, and also because it has its own compute facilities and how it has designed that. So it's becoming a lesson. In fact, Modi, in his speech, was very keen to say that for India, this is an opportunity to use what they have already built, like DPI, to build applications that they can now use to support other countries in the global south.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it doesn't also mean there could also be dependency between global south countries. So we have
Yes.
to be very careful. At
Mm-hmm.
the end of the day, it's how policymakers design these partnerships to ensure that it's mutual benefit, and another dependency is also not beginning to emanate from it.
Mhm. So, in a policy brief that you wrote back all the way back in 2023, and I'm sure you probably think this is like a long time ago, the paper towards a multilateral framework for DPI, you argued that for DPI to truly serve as a tool for sustainable development, it must be supported by a structured multilateral agenda that centers on human-centered principles, which is really something that you're still echoing right now, as you've just shared. So, in that sense, how do we, and especially in relation to funding, how does that particular or that thought process inform or show us how that global powers, especially the US and China, and increasingly the Gulf in recent times, how do you think that they use
Mhm.
that digital investments to gain influence on the continent? And how should African countries approach DPI funding without becoming pawns in geopolitical competition?
Excellent question and framing, and thanks for even surfacing that piece. I think one of the things that we highlighted in the piece, and this last piece on South-South collaboration is something that is extremely critical. Is that investments that African countries are using or are taking up to develop this infrastructure must also be matched with domestic capital.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's for me, I think, is the foundation of building agency around what you're building. This holistic approach of taking the entire package of building your capital, building your investment without matched funds, either from your exchequer, your national treasury, or from private sector. I think that becomes a pathway that can lead to more dependency, as opposed to when it's matched.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you bring in your private sector, you bring in your own finances, then it becomes a mutual platform of engagement, or at least it is agency between both ways. And for me, it's a proposal that even as we look at the multilateral funding, so we should also be looking at the AFDB, the
Mm-hmm.
Africa Development Bank, and other regional facilities that are within the continent. And we've seen if AFDB has announced quite a big fund. I can look at it just recently, 2 weeks ago, on to build AI. And I think this is a critical step, because I think we need to start seeing this happening within countries.
Yes.
So when a country, is it China, is it South Africa, is it Zambia, is it Nigeria, that countries also have to have their own, I would call them sovereign funds or sovereign, and I know there's sovereign wealth funds has its own name, its
Mm-hmm.
own meaning. I think there's an understanding that countries have to develop their own funding architecture
Mm-hmm.
domestically, based first on what they can offer, and then how do they match it up with other foreign capital? Because I think that will be the key of ensuring that dependency is not being anchored within the relationship.
Mm-hmm. So, do you think that, or is non alignment realistic in the digital era, or does Africa need a new form of strategic hedging?
Good question. Tough question too. I think alignment is it should be defined depending on what it matters to and to who. When I think of alignment, especially for and how we are seeing it in surfacing, at least in the African continent, is aligning to the goal and aspiration or the vision of a country.
Mm-hmm.
But when you go to the um, hegemonic politics, or you go to the bigger politics that are happening, the geopolitics, it becomes a different question of alignment. It becomes an alignment of, is it the East, is it China, or is it the US?
Mm-hmm.
And I think these layers sometimes can be complementary, or they can be in conflict. But I think it's important for African countries to come to the table with, what does alignment mean for them?
Mm-hmm.
And we begin to see some leaders who are very clear in saying alignment for us means, how can we best discharge on the duties or on the plans and visions for our country? So alignment to that goal or purpose, I think, is the first way that African leaders are beginning to look at it, and maybe the most practical, especially efficient way of looking at it. Because honestly, as a country, as I know, it's important that you also understand what is your priority. What
Sure.
is it that you want out of this?
Mm-hmm.
Is it if it's independency and the best for your countries, then alignment has to start with your purpose and plan and vision. And it goes back to the point that I spoke earlier about, that it is important that countries always start their AI journey or the technology journey
Mm-hmm.
with having a plan and a purpose for where they want to go with this. And aligning to that, and what we've seen so far, it's aligning to those visions and goals. So for a country like like for Rwanda has been a big champion of AI, is ensuring that they are able to have the compute and the applications around that. Coming out of the Indian AI Summit, we saw Rwanda sign a partnership with Anthropic to
Mm-hmm.
help them with their education and their health systems. This is the kind of alignment that I say that is critical to start seeing. That is alignment that serves the purpose and output of it vis-a-vis the global geopolitics. Those will be there, and unfortunately, they're not being shaped mostly by Africa. We are influencing it, But since we are not the critical players, then it's important that Africa understands its role within this.
Mhm.
We also see the conversation about middle powers. They're beginning to come together to understand how best does that work for us. When we came out of Davos, the Prime Minister for Canada was very strong about how do we reshape the order, or how do we engage in this continent, in this world, so it best works for what works for middle powers, for Canada, and so forth. So I think this is the narrative on the table now. Despite the shaping being done by China, US, then how do countries begin to understand this is our priority? This is where we need to start from, and how do we shape that based on our priorities?
These are priorities. I think, that's a very pragmatic response, and maybe I don't know. I think we'll go with the flow. It probably requires its own episode alone. The conversation around alignment and non-alignment. I think that's definitely one of the big questions especially in IR, in international relations at the moment.
Yeah.
But sticking to this, you're Kenyan, and I think
Yeah.
a big part of the philosophy here at Strangers is to we take it seriously of when we use the word African, or when we refer to things as African, it's important to appreciate that there are 55 states on this continent, and you spoke about coming to the table with leaders coming to the table with their own priorities. And of course, that means that each of these 55 countries have their own priorities. However, especially sometimes whether it's in the policy space or even just in the political space, or in just in general, we tend to think when we evoke this African terminology as a collective, we tend to think of it in a very idealistic, homogenous sense, as though
Mhm.
we all have the same priorities. And I think that's where the tensions
Yeah.
lie, where we have different priorities, and sometimes those priorities are in conflict with the greater, quote unquote, greater priorities of the collective, right? But I think, like I mentioned, I think that's definitely a conversation for a separate episode. But I think maybe this is the perfect bridge to take you back to home. You're Kenyan, and you've been at the center of the conversation. Of course, the mandatory Kenyan beaded bracelet.
I know, we all wear it. Yeah.
It might as well just replace IDs at this point. In East Africa.
Yeah.
But yeah, you've been at the
Mhm.
center of the conversation around Kenya's role as a digital frontier, and we've just seen Kenya sign a historic strategic partnership with India, pivoting towards things like the DigiLocker pilot and even a trilateral AI deal with Italy, all while navigating a massive $2.5 billion health data framework with the US that's currently tied up in court over privacy concerns. So it seems that Kenya is trying to do exactly what you've advocated for, diversifying its allies to find a path to sovereignty. But this multi-aligned approach does come with its own set of friction points.
Mhm.
And with that, in mind, current Kenya is currently juggling a sovereign AI deal with both India and Italy, and a data-intensive health pact with the US in this scramble to partner with everyone. How does a country like Kenya ensure it isn't creating a fragmented Frankenstein infrastructure that is even harder to govern?
I think this is a question for every policymaker, or at least it should be. That within their partnerships drive, and within their desire to work with as many diverse partners, you're not also creating also another monster or nightmare of
Mhm.
how you start managing others people's relationships. So I think this is where it goes back to, I feel like almost becoming a broken telephone by saying, going back to your plan. Looking at the critical areas, how other players, I see almost like I don't, it's not a chessboard, these puzzles,
Mhm.
these big puzzle pieces, whereby you have to figure out where each part goes. When you buy a puzzle, they all come in different pieces.
Mhm.
But at the end of the day, if you're given the vision board, you have the picture that shows you how it should look like.
True.
Now it's up to you to figure out how each piece fits into that. And
Mhm.
I think this is the mandate of every policymaker. It needs strategy, it needs tact, it needs a wisdom, it
Mhm.
needs a lot of research, and it
Mhm.
also needs to understand the long-term implications within these partnerships. We are seeing like the health deal that you mentioned that is now in court. Is because that yes, it's a noble idea. Yes, it's something that can help develop a digital health system to help track disease outbreaks with a global corporation with the US. But then the question of how do you do that without ensuring that first it's in an open, ethical way, but also the data for Kenyans is protected and the value that is being accrued from sharing that data between two countries is also equally shared between these two countries. So I think we are coming to a point where partnerships are not just casual documents that countries run into. They're not just MOUs you sign, but they also need to be emboldened by deep research. They need to be emboldened by the vision. They also need to have people who spend time negotiating on the table, ensuring that that vision is flowing down into the text of the document. So the text that comes out is text that works for both partners, and it's not just an political statement that becomes binding. And then a few steps into it, you both realize this may not be working into the best interest of it. So and I think that's the best way to look at this puzzle of partnerships and all the different array of partners is what can each partner, what is their strength, what is their capability. Our African countries like Kenya have, as you said, have very strong comparative advantages. It's already building itself as a digital hub. And like most of Africa, it has a very vibrant youth who are very entrepreneurial, who are able to build. And these are some things that some of these countries may not have. So those some of these comparative advantages, and also the energy for Kenya, it has very clean energy that can power data centers and so forth. So understanding, I think, coming to the table, understanding that you also have a leverage to bring to the table, and then empowering even those who are negotiating with that leverage to understand that these are some of the critical areas where these are my bare minimums that help me build the puzzle that I'm trying to create, I think is going to be very critical. So that also means that we move away from some of these, we call them roadside declarations. I think in Africa, we have many of these political statements
Yeah.
that a politician wakes up one day, oh, it's good for my numbers. But I think in the age of AI, we need to be a bit more strategic. And it's important that the political leaders understand the implications of some of these deals and partnerships that are being built.
I think exactly that. I think you've spoken to quite a very important point right there, being able to distinguish between political rhetoric and actual practical policy interventions that do in the end reflect in the reality and the improvement of lives on the African continent. I guess moving to to the conversation to the connection between governance and national security. Um, we usually, whenever we speak about DPI, the conversation is often in reference to considerations around digital ID payments or
Mhm.
to health data systems. We've sort of briefly spoken about that, especially with the court case that's currently taking place in Kenya. And basically, you have spoken about this in your work before about around how these forms of DPI solutions, which are often touted as a form of improving public service, government's public service to their citizens, can create long-term vendor lock-in and erode sovereignty. What does digital self-determination actually require at the infrastructure level?
Uh, there's a couple of ways of looking at this. First, there's the infrastructure level, but but sometimes I say the infrastructure level is not as important as the data
Mm-hmm.
that is riding on the infrastructure, because the infrastructure at some point, until Africa is able to develop this, there's going to be some kind of reliance on the infrastructure that is being from other countries.
Mm.
So first, the negotiation in the buying of that infrastructure is important. But secondly, how you're able to build upon that infrastructure. I think this is where we need to be very nuanced, and that's where I would want to focus on sovereignty as more as agency around that. You may not own the infrastructure, but then do you own the work and the output that this digital infrastructure is building for you. And that when one of the critical things there is the data that rides upon it. Do you have control over it? Do you have the control over the processing, the storage, and so forth that requires for you to build or that is required to build artificial intelligence applications? So for me, that is extremely critical. The second thing is how also the countries are African countries are able to build their own data sets. I think at this point, the building of data sets and ensuring that that data is owned by Africans is something that also needs to become right front and center. We have seen organizations like Masakane, African Voices, that are beginning to ensure that we have large language data sets that can feed these models. And that is the beginning point, because then first those data sets have nuances for African countries, but they're also built within African regimes. So their ownership around them is being accrued within the continent. So digital sovereignty has many facets, and some of them that tend to be there is the ownership of the infrastructure itself. This is key. I'm not saying it's not key, but with the realities of the African continent, that owning this infrastructure is or building it starts from the way from building it is different from building and owning is fast. Those are two very different dynamics. Someone else can build something for you, but you own it, so you have the rights to it, and you're able to actively discharge what you're doing. And I think this is one of the ways we can look at digital infrastructure is the rights that you have within the infrastructure itself and what you're able to build upon it, ensuring that it benefits you. So anyway, I'll stop there, but also I wanted to highlight something that you spoke about earlier, and that I think it's critical for African countries to start understanding that when we have data that is in en masse, because AI runs on huge amounts of data. That some of the way some of our boundaries are working for us may not also be in the best position. The idea that being from Kenya, that sometimes it's hard for my data to move to a neighboring country like Tanzania or up north Ethiopia or Uganda on the other side, but it is one data. Data is one ecosystem. It's a geographical ecosystem. So policy the policies that are defining how we are looking at this approach for digital infrastructure, I think we need to change. We need to start calibrating them, to start looking at them in a more regional approach. Can countries come together to own the infrastructure, and also the data regime, so that then we're able to take advantage of this? One of my own reflections, and it's a shameless plug here, I even wrote a Substack about it, is then how India has been able to harness its numbers, the population of its numbers. Of course, it's one governance regime, so it's easier for them. But even within Africa, even if we are divided within different governance units, I think there's a moment in time where we have to start thinking about how do we harness the data from the different countries and come together to pool the applications that we're putting around it. Initiatives like Sakane African Voice can only be strengthened when data is able to flow, or it's been consolidated in huge buckets for it to be utilized to build AI and DPI applications across the chain. So is that personal data when it comes to your digital ID? If digital IDs between countries are not speaking, we know we both come from countries where even to travel across to come to South Africa, I still have to start thinking about going to look for visas. I have to, there's some now with South Africa that is not there, but there's still many countries within the continent where there are restrictions. There are such strong restrictions as how data moves, how finances move. So it becomes an inhibitor. So I think one of the capabilities that the continent can start building when it comes to own sovereign data, even beyond the infrastructure, is how it builds its data infrastructure.
Absolutely.
It creates a very vast data infrastructure that works for it, and is easy to flow within its innovative and digital ecosystem in the continent.
I mean, thank you, and I'll definitely be sure to share the link to the Substack article. And congratulations on joining us on Substack. Really looking forward to hearing your insights. I think you're able to get to us, to the broader public, quicker than waiting to publish papers sometimes. So yeah, please, I'll definitely, it will be in the comments, so in the description below. And you've raised a really big point around the importance of, perhaps maybe you alluded to it, right, of how can we leverage our numbers that we have on the continent. I mean, by 2050 we are being projected to be the biggest youth population, and we all know that young people are the biggest users and creators and producers of data, right? And so that's a huge leverage to have and to hold. And maybe again, this is something that has definitely been written on as well. A paper that comes to mind is by Ngube and Shomani, I think this is way back in 2023, where they spoke about this, about thinking about data localization and data flows beyond just the national borders, because it really doesn't make sense for, let's say, a small country like Eswatini or Lesotho to have this very locked in data policy that says, the data needs to be locked in within their countries. It then just loses its value. And I think, so I think definitely, please, I'd really definitely encourage the audience to engage with your article and even for policymakers to start taking this much more seriously. I think, people like you or yourself who are writing and doing this work of thinking about this deeply too, it shouldn't just end in just reading, but actually in practical implementation of these things. And a big part of this conversation as well has been around democratization. I think that's definitely the main takeaway from this conversation. And I really am sad to end or close off here. It feels like there's so much more to talk about, and I hope that you be able to come back and to build and on this conversation. But for now, thank you. We have covered a lot of ground today, from the high stakes diplomacy in New Delhi to the courtrooms in Nairobi around data protection and defining the limits of digital power. And I must say that throughout your work, you've made a compelling case for the democratization of AI. And you've also argued that it
Thank you.
isn't enough to just have access to the technology. We need to democratize the capacity to build, to govern, and audit these systems so they reflect African values rather than foreign interests. So before I let you go, I have one final question. As we move towards this democratic diffusion of technology, what is the one non-negotiable principle you think that African societies must hold on to ensure that our digital future remains truly our own?
Oh, just one.
If you have more,
uh,
feel free.
but no, no, no. I think let's stick to one, because I think the last conversation that we just had is, for me, I think is a bare minimum.
Mm,
It should be non-negotiable.
mhm,
That data is sovereign.
mm,
The data being produced in Kenya, in South Africa, in Zambia, in Uganda, name the country, the citizen of that data should be something that is protected,
mhm,
and countries should hold on to the value that is accrued. I think data can move, but then the value of that data should be accrued back. And I think this is one of the ways that we're going to build a sustainable digital ecosystem, is
mhm,
when the exploitation and manipulation of that data is able to be accrued back to African countries. It is not just being exported to build large language models, not in other regions of the world, but the value of that data is building applications for the continent. It's and even when it's been exported to help build the global digital agenda, that value still is being accrued back to the continent. So the intersection of data and its value, that I think is something that needs to be strengthened, and it needs to be a non-negotiable when we talk about sovereignty. But I want to stop there, but I also want to say, Zainab, thank you so much for hosting me. This has been a wonderful conversation. And you're right, I feel like we can talk about some of these things in depth and in detail, because they're very passionate and dear to me.
mm.
So I want to thank you, and I thank God also for this opportunity just to be able to speak with you. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Really, thank you for joining us on Strangers X and for helping us make sense of the power structures behind the screens. And to our listeners, you can find Jane's latest work on the implementation triangle and the Carnegie DPI paper in our show notes. Until next time, remember, governance is about building communities. Let's keep building.